Hello, and welcome to the RAPID7 Webcast, Vulnerabilities Dissected, the Past, Present, and How to Prepare for the Future. My name is Kelly Garofalo, and I'll be the host for this webcast. The webcast will run for approximately 45 minutes, and we will extend that a little bit if we need to, depending on how many questions we have coming in from the audience. We will record the session, and a copy of the recording will be made available on the webcast section of the RAPID7 site in the next few days. You can ask questions at any time using the chat feature, and we will try to address them during the Q&A. Today's speakers, not yet. The attendees of this webcast are eligible for 1 CPE credit, and you can self-report on your organization's website. We strongly recommend you keep the email invitation as confirmation for possible future audits. So for detailed instructions on how you can self-report, please visit bit.ly/R7CPE as seen on your screen, and note that the URL is case sensitive. So now on to the speakers for today's webcast. We have Ross Barrett, a Senior Security Engineering Manager here at RAPID7, and Nate Crampton, Product Marketing Manager at RAPID7. Now over to you guys.
Great, thanks Kelly, and thanks audience. We really have a great webcast in store for you today. First, Ross, I just wondered if you could kind of give a little bit more of an overview to the audience, about yourself and specifically about, what your team does and what they work on here at RAPID7.
Sure, Nate, thanks. I've been in the security industry for 9+ years now, primarily working in vulnerability management and originally on vulnerability content, and then moved on to, well, I gave up my credibility and became a manager, but I'm now responsible for the team in RAPID7 that creates all of our vulnerability content, all our policy content, and our scan engine capabilities. So we do everything that if an exposed customer or a RAPID7 customer is using your product, we do the bits that go out on talk to the computers on the network and gather information from them and bring them back and assess whether that translates to a known vulnerability or a known configuration issue.
Great. So I think it's safe to say that you know a thing or two about vulnerabilities.
I try.
Well, now that you're a manager, maybe it's your team that knows more about them.
I rely on them heavily for anything that's really tight.
Good, good. And I think that it's really relevant, to the audience. Ross, he's been, in the industry for a while. He knows, vulnerabilities inside and out, and his team works on them. So definitely feel free. Anytime a question comes up, there's a chat window, and just enter the question. We'll try to get through it either during the presentation itself, or at the end we'll answer the questions. But definitely don't hesitate on any sort of questions that you want to ask. Okay, so today's webcast, we are just going to go through the quick agenda, and then we'll go through each of the slides. So the first thing is we want to give you just a quick overview of vulnerabilities. I know that everyone on the phone, or at least I hope everyone on the phone, knows what a vulnerability is. But we actually want to, basically set the stage. And then what we're going to go into is, the history of vulnerabilities and some of the shifts that we've seen of vulnerabilities over time. And then the next thing we're going to talk about is how vulnerability risk isn't necessarily all the same. And as a security professional, you shouldn't treat every vulnerability exactly the same. We'll go in through some different techniques for how to actually look at the risk from those things. And then the next thing is we're going to talk about how to actually find vulnerabilities like attackers. So what are some of the high-level techniques that they're using, and see how that actually relates to when you're actually trying to find vulnerabilities. What does it actually mean? And then the final thing that we're going to talk about is the future of vulnerabilities and some tips to help you prepare for the future. And then finally we'll have our Q&A session. So definitely again feel free to answer any of the questions through the window itself. All right, so now let's begin with quick set the stage of what is a vulnerability. And so a vulnerability is basically a weakness in software, and it's caused by two things: either a configuration issue or a programming error itself. And it's something that could be exploited. It doesn't mean that it has been exploited, but just that it has a potential to be exploited itself. So now we're actually going to talk about the different categories of vulnerabilities. So I'm going to hand this over to Ross. And Ross, as we go through each of these different categories, if you can kind of give us just a quick overview and then maybe a specific example of the type of vulnerability itself. So the first one is remote code execution.
So sure, and these vulnerabilities, this is one way of categorizing vulnerabilities. We're actually where you're looking at Microsoft terminology here. This is how they categorize vulnerabilities. There are other schemes. If you're a CISSP, you're certainly familiar with the CIA triad of confidentiality, integrity, and availability. You can further subdivide those. I don't know, but I don't think you can roll them up and really be all that specific anymore. But the way this scheme certainly talks about remote code execution, and Nate, why don't you just bring up the all four so I can kind of roll through them?
Sure.
Thanks. So it's, I mean, remote code execution is anything, and this is sort of broadly used, anything that allows an attacker to execute code on your system in a privileged or elevated state. And this is a very usually when people think of it as a classic kind of wormable vulnerability, this is in place, but also has been broadened and to expand things where the user is tricked into executing malicious content, so like browser-based vulnerabilities, things that are email client vulnerabilities. If the user can be coerced or manipulated into clicking on something that is then going to do something unfavorable, then this would fall into the category of remote code execution. Elevation of privilege is similar in the sense that you're going to get. It's usually looking at a box where you've already gained some sort of credential, whereas remote code execution will be looking at something where the user has no credential, no privilege at all. Elevation of privileges, and they maybe have user-level access either legitimately or illegitimately, and then they're going to use that as an elevation of privilege volume to jump up to administrator or system-level privileges or root, or depending on the type of system. Information disclosure. This one I find is often really misunderstood because people think, oh, I'm leaking a document, or they can read what's on my screen, and those exist, but far more common is and you're also seeing with the cloud and web-based vulnerabilities, you're seeing things that leak like the contents of somebody else's online files or online file system. But the classic information disclosure just dumps a random section of memory out, and usually it's random or directable section of memory, which then could be analyzed to gain stuff, or if you do it frequently enough, you're going to get something useful. And then denial of service, the little icon there that Nate picked is actually looking more like a distributed denial of service, but it's any sort of attack where the objective or the result is that the system being attacked is taken offline, is not available. People usually talk about persistent denial of service versus sustained. That the difference being that I can persistent denial of service, I would have to do something that disables the service until somebody interacts with it. They go and restart it. They reset the machine. A sustained one is usually more about the volume of an attack going through, and so it has to be continually being pressed on to continually being the pressure maintained in order to keep the system offline. And that's where you see the contents of the DDoS, the distributed denial of service, coming in from a botnet that seems to be iconized there, where a large number of systems are used to bring down one or a few systems. Roughly that's it for our categories.
Okay, very good. Thank you. And now we're going to move on to, now that you've laid the framework for the rest of the discussion, I think what we want to jump into is, what is the history, like where have vulnerabilities actually come from, and like what are the things that we're starting to see now with vulnerabilities?
Yeah, so Nate and I talked over how to present this quite a bit, and at one point we had like a list of vulnerabilities and different types and showing how they're different, and I said to him last night, I was like, look, let's just put that all away, put up a picture of Kevin Mitnick on one side and something to do with the point of sale system on the other side, and we'll talk through it, because the more we talked about this slide, the more we realized that the past and present aren't all that different in some levels, and there's some levels that are very the same. And so I mean, Kevin Mitnick, who is pictured there in his younger self, and has gone on to be a very respectable and serious security professional, had an earlier career where he was a criminal hacker, and he accomplished a number of really celebritized things, and a lot of it he did was social engineering. He talked his way into the main operator room at an AT&T center, pushed the walls of NSA gear out of the way, or maybe it was before the NSA gear was there, and used this to take over phone networks and steal information, and steal source code for the VAX operating system, and all sorts of other things. And so the underlying technology things he did have come and gone. Those specific things are probably not all that relevant, we hope, anymore. But the way he did it, the way he talked his way in and got credentials and got information, that's still very relevant, and we're still seeing that in the context today, where social engineering and the loss of identity and loss of personal information is a huge risk to the individual and the organization. Nowadays, though, you're seeing, well, we've all heard about recent attacks on point-of-sale systems, but the underlying mechanism by which that is, it's a new theater of operations, but the underlying mechanisms that are used to execute that kind of attack still involve a number of different techniques, which are not. They're not mechanisms which are a number of different techniques which are not all that new, and so there's a mix of social engineering. We don't know exactly how the one I'm alluding to got into play, but they haven't disclosed that yet. But we're seeing the same sort of thing over and over again, where credentials are lost, access is gained, and privilege is then elevated. And we're going to talk a bit more about how that actually plays out in the real world and what you can do to protect yourselves against it in the coming slides.
Okay, good, excellent. And now let's actually talk a little bit about trending of vulnerabilities. So on the right-hand side, I know we talked about this a little bit before, before we had this webcast, is we basically have like the CVE chart, basically how the vulnerabilities, at least the ones that are associated to CVEs, have actually changed over the course of time. But as we were chatting, it seems like there's definitely some flaws if you're only using that as a gauge of how basically vulnerabilities are trending. I was wondering if you could maybe just go talk, share with the audience, about that chart. Maybe explain some of the rises and falls of it, and then also some of the the caveats to that particular way of looking at it.
So CVE, which stands for, if you're not familiar, is Common Vulnerability Enumeration. It's an index that lets you look up a vulnerability, and that when multiple vendors or individuals are discussing a vulnerability, we can all point to one number and say, specifically, I'm talking about this thing, and it is this particular SQL injection or this particular buffer overflow that we're discussing in those circumstances or assessing the risk of. And it's very useful in that regard. And it is commonly accepted, especially in the vulnerability management industry, as a metric both of coverage and of a tying into risk. You're vulnerable to this many CVEs, your product covers this many CVEs. Not necessarily a bad thing. However, there was a great presentation which really codified something that people already know, is that a certain type of researcher and a certain type of hacker will go and report everything they get to for a CVE. Some vendors have a policy of disclosing everything that they find in their own products for a CVE, other vendors don't. But top-of-the-line pen testers, foreign governments, they are not taking, oh, hey, look, I found an ODE in Windows. I can use this to break into customer systems. That's how I make my money. I should register it for a CVE. Of course not. They don't do that, because then they lose their mechanisms. So anything that's out there that's not disclosed, anything that's out there that's being actually used by the most leading edge hackers doesn't have a CVE yet, may never have a CVE. There was a great presentation, I think I alluded to at Black Hat already last year, where the chief researcher from NIST, MITRE NIST, that runs the CV program, and the lead guy at the Open Vulnerability Database both got together and talked for about 45 minutes, and I'm not going to spend 45 minutes. You can look up their slides online if you want to, but about why CVEs or any vulnerability index is a kind of only, is at best, my phrasing of it is at best it's a reflection of what's going on in the industry. So you see spikes, you're like, oh, if we look at this, there's been, 2006 was the worst year for vulnerabilities. We had the most. We didn't have that many, see that many again until 2013. There must have been a lot of security flaws in 2006. Not really. 2006 was probably the peak of CVE becoming commonly adopted, and there was a lot of older stuff that got covered in there. But as they pointed out, like in 2012, there was like a huge chunk of CVEs was applied just to a single researcher who dropped about 5 years worth of research on a number of products and went out and said, I want CVE for everything I've done. And other years we've seen spikes because somebody defines a class of vulnerability. For example, the example they use was related to like weak linking between package dependencies in certain package management products, and then goes and enumerates a couple thousand instances of that particular type of vulnerability, and all of a sudden, boom, 2012 has a 2000 CVE spike because this person somebody basically pointed out a new way of identifying the same thing over and over again. Microsoft releases a CVE for every thing that they patch, but we know for sure that Microsoft has hundreds of vulnerabilities that have been disclosed to them, hundreds is being very, very optimistic or very conservative, shall we say, that don't have a CVE because they haven't issued a patch yet. So take it as a representation of the trend, but it's certainly far from being an absolute count of the number of vulnerabilities that are out there that you have to worry about.
Yeah, good. So I mean, so let's say one of the security professionals on this call, one of their bosses, like, oh my God, these CVs are going up. Are there any? I mean, basically what you just said. I mean, that's basically how they should explain it to them, or it actually shows you kind of like directionally shift, but actually don't rely on that number as actually proof that, hey, there's more vulnerabilities that are out there.
There's more vulnerabilities out there because there's more software out there, and there's more and more products. You're gonna continue. CVEs will continue to trend up. It's kind of an anomaly. They did have a couple of down years, but I think in the long term you're going to see them trend up. They just refactored the CVE numbering scheme to accommodate more than 10,000 being allocated in a year. And they're looking a year or two down the road when we hit that point, but they're going to keep going up because there's more software. Is just what it boils down to. It's kind of proportional. Until we have a major.
So it doesn't look like there's any light at the end of the road.
No, I don't see it yet at this point. I think we're a long way from that kind of trusted, totally trusted platform. And even then, there'll still be human weaknesses. There'll still be interaction weak points where it's just not cost effective for companies to entirely always be putting out secure software all the time. So,
yeah,
unfortunate.
I think we've seen that in the news recently too, where some high-tech startup companies were trying to get a product to market, but necessarily might not have been tested completely.
Yeah, at all.
Yeah, at all.
Some sort of instant messaging chatting program that some people used. Yes, we heard about that one.
Yep. Yeah, cool. All right. So now that we've done a quick overview of what is a vulnerability, we've kind of talked about some of the trends that we're seeing within the vulnerabilities. Let's talk about how the risk from vulnerabilities are not all the same. So one of the things I think that people really need to, and most people get this, I think it's just maybe reiterating a point that you guys already know, that like every organization is different. I mean, you have different businesses, you have different business models, you have different systems, different networks. You have different data that's on those systems, and then you also have different sets of vulnerabilities. And what that basically means is that each organization, when you look at a particular the vulnerabilities themselves, that they can be different. So a particular vulnerability that's on one system might be a completely different risk level than another system itself. I think this is pretty obvious, but a lot of the tools out there don't really provide you with a way to actually provide that context for your prioritization itself. Let's actually talk about, let's actually go through each of the vulnerability risk impacts.
Sure.
So, Ross, I wonder if you can kind of just lead us through these.
Sure. So, I mean, really simply, risk is a factor. Any quantification of risk is a factor of the likelihood of something occurring and the cost of it occurring, or multiplied by, or however you want to think of it, as its cost of it occurring. So, if something's very likely to occur but doesn't really matter, then it's a low-risk scenario. For example, someone port scanning your internal address. It's happening right now. You are being port scanned right now, for sure. There are researchers I know who are continuously port scanning every address on the internet. So you're getting hit. It's not, but they impact you. It doesn't matter. It doesn't hurt you in any way. It's a couple of bits, maybe a few bytes of data going by. So whatever. Now the risk of somebody running a remote exploit on your domain controller and gaining system level access is a very bad thing. They would have access to your entire network. They can then change group policies to roll out malware to every device in your network. Like, imagine that scenario. And your admins are sitting there wiping the malware, and every time they reboot the machine, it's reinstalled by group policy. That is a very, very, very bad thing to have happen. The likelihood of it happening is, well, that would, hopefully you've got some security controls in place, and that takes a lot of maneuvering, a lot of things to line up for an attacker to get that level of access. So the vulnerability categories that we talked about earlier comes into play. Information disclosure vulnerability by itself isn't going to really hurt you too much, but remote code execution can. How hard it is, if you're familiar with the CVSS V2 scoring, that does have an exploitability factor into it, which considers the likelihood of something being exploited. And some things that get patched and get a CVE number are, as far as anybody knows, impossible to actually exploit. A great recent example is that Microsoft patched a remote code execution critical risk vulnerability in Forefront for Exchange this week. They put it out in Patch Tuesday this week. And I was talking to the guys at Microsoft. I'm like, well, this is a huge deal. You've got this remotely exploitable thing. It's a perimeter service. Everybody's going to hit it. Are we going to see a worm? And they're like, well, no, we don't think so. We found this internally in a code review. As far as we can tell, there's no actual way to hit this code. We're just being, cautious about our housekeeping. Let's not be too over the top about it. And so the fact that now, of course, there's a class of people in the world, some of them who I have the privilege of working with, who take that as a personal challenge to go and find a way to prove the vendor wrong, and we'll spend a lot of time on that, and they're very capable. But you have to look at that of, is this something that anyone can run? Is that can someone download a script that runs this, or is it accessible only to maybe the top 5 exploit writers in the world? That's the whole range there. And as we said, by location of the asset, not necessarily meaning the physical location, but whether it's located in your DMZ, in your inside your firewall, outside your firewall. Is this your web server? Is this your internal DNS server? Is it a corporate laptop that's traveling right now? Is a factor where the risk, where the access is, how exposed it is, and as I alluded to, the importance, whether this has got critical information on it, whether it's a database server, whether it's got access to other systems. All those things factor into risk because they become into a factor of the value of the system.
And one thing that that I've heard from a few times from people in the security industry is, can you just quickly go over, what the difference of, exploits and exploit kits are, and basically how those relate together? I think that sometimes the understanding of how an exploit kit actually works might be I'd be interested to share.
Well, let me take that even one step further back. The difference between the relationship of vulnerability and an exploit. Mm-hmm. So vulnerability is a flaw, as you said earlier. It's a flaw in a piece of software. An exploit is code that takes advantage of that flaw. And an exploit kit. So usually when somebody talks about an exploit kit, they're talking about something that's commercially available, often for a cost. To buy, and some of these things are actually fairly sophisticated, that allows you to buy a package of a system of running exploits, which can get updates and can be used actively, sometimes with fairly interactive console, to enable to allow people to perform these attacks and to perform these attacks on a large scale. So exploit kit, some of them are very sophisticated. Some of them are like they have update mechanisms, and a licensing scheme that's on par with enterprise software, but they're being run by black hats out of rogue nations. So that's the relationship there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's crazy how cheap some of those things can even be too. The exploit kits themselves.
Yeah, I remember reading that was a black hole was something like. The subscription was like $15 a year or something like that. I think the initial cost was a bit more. Yeah, they're not out of range of the average person, but they're in most cases they're not actually illegal. It's the use of them and how you use them is illegal. Mm-hmm. If you use them for illegal things, that's where you get into the legal quandary.
Yeah. Good, perfect. And that kind of leads into our next topic, which is, how basically to find vulnerabilities like attackers themselves. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about some of the techniques that hackers are using to find vulnerabilities.
Sure. And as the slide up there shows, there's another presentation that you can get online from our site done by Dan Tentler, who's one of our pen testers, which kind of goes way into more detail about this and the hacker mindset and how to understand it. But in a really kind of higher level of overview, if an attacker is targeting you, and this is the point that I'm making here, the distinction I'm making is as opposed to trying to find anybody, but if they're targeting you, if they're going after your environment, your corporate network that you're charged with defending, they start out kind of like a typical military operation would. They're going to do a discovery phase, a reconnaissance phase. They're going to look for information that's publicly available or easily available that gives them some sense of the layout of your network, the organizational structure of your environment, who's a domain admin, who works in the IT department, Where, if they're looking at a physical access, they might start looking at where physical systems are. That depends on the nature of the nature and methods of the attacker. And that's not at all far-fetched. Especially, commercial pen testers will climb fences and sneak in back doors and try to talk their way through into data centers to do this. Or they'll probe their system and network through, online, through port scans, through soft mechanisms, whether that's Nmap, whether that's just, getting interactive with your web server and seeing like what it actually has enabled and what it's responding to. And then passive and active engagement is where you sort of get into, are they studying you still as part of the recon phase? Are they gathering information, or either they're actually trying to break in right now? Whether they're moving in and they're running exploits, they're stealing credentials, they've captured hashes with passwords and moving in, gathering information. And then post-exploitation is usually like what pen testers are talking about. Either they're running away with their prize and filtering data out, or in a pen tester's case, they're preparing their report to show to your senior management about what they got. But the recon phase is what I really wanted to call it, about the fact that they're going to start doing their research if you're a targeted target.
And I've been hearing about chaining vulnerabilities. I was wondering if you could just share exactly like what this is and why people should care about it.
And honestly, this is one of the things I try to beat on every month when I'm talking about Microsoft Patch Tuesdays, and really trying to encourage people to pay attention to. When I laid out those categories earlier, elevation of privilege and information disclosure vulnerabilities, they certainly seem less of a threat. They're less of a concern on some level than your traditional remote code execution. They have a lower number in the ranking scale. They're lower priority. Sure, they are. Yes, absolutely. But they're not unimportant. And in the age of the worm, so if you'll pardon me that expression, has passed. The era of Sasser and Blaster and things that are, I can just run something from sitting at my desk. I can attack your network and take control of the system from across the internet. That's really, really infrequent now, and really pushed out to the fringe systems. And yeah, there's environments that don't get updated, and there's environments that are still running obsolete software. But those things are kind of behind us to some extent. We have mitigations in place, and that mitigate them, even if they're not, even if they do exist in the software framework. What we do see is lots and lots and lots of little things that get put together by skilled attackers to gain access. And the most common scenario is, and I think in the example of the most common scenario is the is the recon phase, where they're either using social engineering or some sort of information disclosure vulnerability to gain access to the system, to get usernames, to get the layout. We recently saw that somebody somewhat maliciously, or probably as more of a research project, went and mapped all the relationships on LinkedIn and put the information up on somewhere on the Amazon cloud, I think, so that you could essentially graph everybody's relationship to everybody else on LinkedIn and look at who knows who. Why does this matter? Well, if you get a phishing campaign email that comes from somebody who's a first degree or second degree in a network who you probably actually know and have met in person, and it's talking about an event that you might both be going to, you're way more likely to click on that than a poorly spelled, badly put together email from somebody you've never heard of saying, "Hey friend, please check enclosed document." Like, as users get more sophisticated, they're going to be more and more likely to fall for these things, as we've seen in a number of occasions. So that kind of thing, getting that little bit of information, that information disclosure, that little bit of social engineering to get that, leads to the next thing, where maybe they're not going to necessarily get you all the way there. Your box is probably patched. You probably are not going to just say, well, I'll type my domain credentials into this random website, but maybe they've got your username. Maybe they've figured out your Active Directory user and machine name at that point. And from there, maybe they'll do something like, okay, we've gained a little bit of a foothold on the network, either by compromise, maybe we've compromised your phone, let's say. And then we're going to use that to wait till you authenticate, do a domain authentication, and pick up the hash of your credentials. Then we're going to replay that hash to get onto another system where the domain administrator didn't log out. We're going to steal their credentials, steal the hash of their credentials, and now you've got domain admin privileges. Or maybe they'll use, once they get onto that system, maybe that once they get from your phone to a desktop, they could use a kernel overflow, and Microsoft loves patching those. Microsoft pays a lot of attention to this, you can see, because they're patching kernel and kernel driver overflows pretty much every month. And those are almost exclusively elevation and privilege vulnerabilities, where you're already on the system, and then you exploit this to get system-level access. So you exploit one of those, you've chained these things together. You started out with nothing. You started out with a LinkedIn profile and a little bit of know-how, but you never hit the jackpot. You never had at any one point say, oh, I've totally owned their entire network with one shot. It's just step by step by step by step. If you talk to people in our pen testing department, they will tell you that pretty much every single pen test goes this way. That they get in a little bit and they steal credentials, and then they use those credentials somewhere with some small hack to elevate privilege. And this happens over and over again. The good pen testers are doing it and sharing to teach. The bad guys are doing it to steal your data. That's all I have to say about that one, Nick.
Okay, perfect. Thanks. It definitely helps, set the context, and it helps also show why, not all the vulnerabilities are created equal themselves. I mean, you may have one that has a particularly low score, but it's something that, from a priority standpoint, they should actually pay attention to. So, perfect, great. Thank you for that. I think the next part that we really want to talk about is the vulnerability future. So what are some of the things that we're seeing, and what is some of the advice that you can give to the audience out there?
Yeah, and we joke this is the wrong time of year to be doing predictions. Usually everybody does their predictions, right around the new year. But at the same time, I didn't want to try to talk about far future, so I made Nate put the word near on the front of this slide, because there's a lot of stuff that's just coming down the road that's a mere months away that we're seeing. We're already seeing the first waves of, and I can't understate how. Or I can't overstate, sorry, how important the end of life for support for Windows XP is going to be. And I think Office 2003 and a couple other major platforms are ending around there from Microsoft, but that's huge. XP is a very widely deployed operating system. XP Embedded is running a ton of point-of-sale systems out there, a ton of embedded systems. It still has a gigantic market share. There are a lot of things that have been disclosed to Microsoft that they are not going to get around to patching. And there's a lot of things that haven't been disclosed that are going to pop up right after this goes end of life, and Microsoft will be vulnerable to essentially forever. If you are in a top, Fortune 1000 enterprise, you can probably afford to pay Microsoft for ongoing support. That's not something they really advertise, but it actually is a real thing that Microsoft will sell patches for specific things to vendors who pay them bucket loads of cash, boatloads of cash. But that isn't going to help the most of the world who isn't in that thing. Those agreements around those patches are that they do not make them publicly available, unfortunately. Makes it difficult for us to cover them, too. But this will be the biggest story of the second quarter of this year, is that when XP support ends in April, there's going to be stuff coming out right afterwards that we're going to see a spike in, hey, I'm going to try to take advantage of this time frame here where we can own a whole lot of boxes. And it's Microsoft's business model. They're doing this because it helps them sell Windows 8 and Windows 7 licenses. They don't need to end XP support. You are more secure on a modern operating system, which has memory management and ASLR and all those things available. Sure, it's for your best interest to go to a newer operating system, but this will be a difficult, costly thing for the whole world to
So what do you think there's a chance that they would actually delay it, or do you think that
there's no chance at all? There's no chance at all. Their business model, no offense to any Microsofties who are listening, but their business model, and I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm a big fan of Microsoft's security plan. I'm not generally overly critical of them and like a knee-jerk reaction. I'm a Microsoft certified professional myself. I've worked with their products for even beyond security before I worked in the security industry, and work closely with the Microsoft guys every month on Patch Tuesday. But their business model means that they need to do this. They need to end support for a really old, 14-year-old operating system, or 12 years or however old it is now at this point, 12-year-old operating system, so that they can sell more of their new operating system. They're not going to delay it. So beyond that, and I kind of wanted to, is that, mobile and cloud platforms are going to be more attacked. Yes, I think everybody has heard this before. Mobile has been talked about. Cloud has been talked about. We know this. Kind of to my point about the past and the present, you're not necessarily seeing entirely new classes of attacks against mobile and cloud. They're just out there on the perimeter, the frontier, where necessarily, we moved to the cloud and we forgot best practices about deployment, or we moved to the mobile and we've installed all sorts of crappy apps on our phone that have absolutely no rigor around how they're put together, and they're full of vulnerabilities, or they're thinly veiled covers for stealing your personal information and monitoring where you are all day and what you're doing. And that this kind of like leakage of information especially on mobile, for individual is going to be the continual bread and butter of the black market personal information industry. It's going to be the continue to be the stepping stone by which attackers gain access to an organization. And that, to my point, to that point about they're going to use this to directly attack payment systems. More and more people are using their phones and mobile devices to pay for things. I do it myself. I like my Starbucks app. I get my coffee and tea that way every single day. But if you think about how it's not really all that a secure system. As an example, there's no validation in there in your Starbucks app. It's just the image on your screen that essentially becomes a barcode. Somebody scans that. Somebody installs a bit of malware on your phone that takes a screen capture when you hit the Pay Now button on your Starbucks app, something like that, or anywhere else. So I'm using Starbucks example because that's what I have on my phone, but there's many others out there, and you're getting more and more into the scan a check and deposit into your account, mobile banking things, pay for your groceries with a swipe of your phone. That you're seeing more and more of this. These will be attacked because this is essentially where the money is flowing. If that is where money if there's a financial transaction happening, then it's going to bring people who want to leech off of that. And then totally different direction, not really about the individual. And the cringeworthy term of cyber warfare, yes, we've all seen it thrown around, but I really wanted to just draw out my point that what we're seeing in cyber warfare is an asymmetrical battleground. It's akin to it's oddly akin at the same time to a guerrilla warfare tactic and the Cold War nuclear arms race, because it's something where a group that has no capability of standing up to or fighting or defeating another organization in a traditional kinetic battle can do harm and do attacks. And so you have that asymmetrical factor to it. And at the same time, you've got nation-states, nations that are building up their cyber arsenals as a deterrent to cyber attacks from other nations. And you're seeing that particularly in some countries where the likelihood of actually having any sort of traditional warfare be successful is very low, but the rise of the sort of arm's-length political hacker is very high. And we've already seen things like even in the current conflict in Syria, where the Syria Free Army was, I believe, defacing the New York Times or CNN, I don't remember, but that kind of thing is moving out of the random quote-unquote hacktivist and moving into an actual organization, actual global organization is doing it. And then the other point here on the side of this is that you're seeing that nation states are using these capabilities to engage in economic espionage. They're targeting foreign companies. They're targeting specific high-profile individuals with information and access to business practices and proprietary knowledge, so that they can bring them back to their own nations for profit. And so that kind of stuff is being leveraged all the time. And we just saw something was revealed this week. They called, I think, the mask malware that has been theoretically running. They're looking at possibly for as long as 6 years now, and like within 30 minutes of it being discovered and disclosed, was wiped from all the infected systems. But looks like a very, very, very sophisticated bit of malware attack targeting, probably authored by a Spanish-speaking programmer or team of programmers based on the source code, and targeting, I believe the most infections were actually in Morocco, of all places. I don't know why. I'm not a global political science person. I don't know why anybody who from a Spanish-speaking nation, maybe they were just, mercenary in that regard, but would go after Morocco. But it was apparently looking like one of the more sophisticated APT, things along the lines of Stuxnet, and Dooku that we've seen so far. And I've run on for quite some time, Nate, but that's all I have to say about that one too. Nate, are you on mute?
Oh,
Hello?
sorry, I was on mute. But thank you for giving us the the insight into some of the things that you're seeing definitely in the near future. It helps, really set the context of, what we're seeing, especially, as a, company that has a vulnerability management solution, some of the types of things that we're seeing that's out there. So that's awesome. Could you kind of just share quickly some of the tips that you think that you have for the audience?
Yeah, and I kind of touched on this before, is that this isn't oh my gosh, nothing's working, we have to try entirely new processes. I think what we're seeing is that take the things that we've already learned in the desktop and server world and continue to apply them in the cloud, apply them to our mobile devices. The principles of least access is certainly crucial, especially in mitigating the risk of like stolen credentials and replayed credentials and the pass the hash type of attacks. You definitely want to just make sure that you're actually keep doing what we've been doing, I think is what I'm saying to people. Just make sure you're still doing it in the cloud and for the mobile users, and don't just turn your back on those things. All the same game applies. You don't necessarily have the same tool sets to do them, especially with mobile, but the same principles and best practices are still relevant, and they're what's going to make you, for the time being at least, if not able to outrun the bear, at least able to outrun your friends.
So it doesn't seem like there's any new silver bullet. It's really, taking, what you know and keeping to do that, but just kind of looking at it a little bit differently, best practices with the new types of vulnerabilities.
Yeah.
Threats that you're seeing.
I don't believe that there will be a silver bullet in the computing and internet age that we are currently faced with, but you will be able to mitigate your own risk if you take the sort of precautions that have been pushed for a long time. Defense in depth. Keep up to date with patching. Configure your systems. Don't run unnecessary services. Least access for your users. Nothing groundbreaking. Nothing new here. Just don't turn a blind eye to the systems that are already that are growing and the way the systems are changing, and don't assume that the rules don't apply to them or that somebody else is doing it for you. I tell you almost for sure that your platform as a service vendor or your cloud computing vendor is not taking care of security for you unless you have a very specific special contract with them about that, and your ISP for your phone is certainly not. So, yeah.
Well, good. Awesome. Well, I think it is just about time for the questions and answers. So the audience, please definitely feel free in the question window to enter any questions that you might have. So one person had a question. It's kind of like more of I would think an authentication question. So it's really like how you have cloud services that are authenticating to like Active Directory. I wonder if you could kind of explain just like, I guess the question that the audience member has is, when you terminate them in Active Directory, does, basically if you're doing that authentication with like a particular cloud service, will that automatically revoke their access to that cloud service?
Huh. Okay.
Or I don't know if it depends.
I think it depends. I think the only answer to that can be depends. So the cloud service is authenticating, or somebody's authenticating to a cloud service via Active Directory, and you terminate that user's account in Active Directory, it should immediately, there might be a replication delay. And honestly, this is a great question, because it's the same. I think it's the same scenario that you're going to see even in like a corporate LAN, where you might terminate an account, and that should propagate right away. But in the reality is it might be 15 minutes later before the VPN, it kicks that person off. Or it might never kick them off if they have a persistent connection. And that's something you got to watch out for, is that you're moving through heterogeneous networks, and part of that includes cloud services. And it's going to depend on the cloud service and how it's implemented, but yeah, it should go if I go and re-authenticate, but it doesn't necessarily terminate a current connection. And it's really going to be subjective to what the cloud service in question is.
Yeah, cool. And they should probably reach out to the cloud service provider too, to maybe see if they have some guidelines around that too.
Yeah, or whoever it is, or your developers, whatever, if it's a custom project.
Yep. Okay, cool. Here is another question. So the question is, more and more we see vendors claiming vulnerabilities as being false positive due to being embedded operating systems and not actually running full versions of services. Are you seeing this trend in false positives?
So the software vendor is saying that this vulnerability doesn't apply to them because it's an embedded system as opposed to
embedded operating system. Yeah.
embedded operating system. Well, ask your point of sale. No, that's no. Facetious jokes aside, I can certainly. It depends on the scoping of the vulnerability question. You're going to have situations where, yeah, like, oh, this applies to Windows XP. X applies to Windows XP, and it doesn't apply to Windows XP embedded because it is Windows XP embedded. Those are true, and I mean that might be a false positive from your vulnerability management side if they're saying that in some cases. But just because it's an embedded system doesn't mean it's immune to everything else in the operating system, and the same exploit might not work. It's compiled for a different architecture, but it doesn't mean it's immune. It means that it might be a little harder. And again, it's a very subjective question. You'd have to look at, like, well, what is specifically here? If it's something like, oh, well, this is a vulnerability in IIS, and I'm running Windows XP embedded, which doesn't have IIS, then of course you're not vulnerable. And so, like, a really, really preliminary system might identify all the XP on the network, not really take into account that this is XP embedded, and say, yep, you're vulnerable to this. We know you are. But that would be a mistake for sure. But a privilege elevation affecting the kernel probably is still vulnerable, even if the exploitation code would be different.
Okay, good, awesome. Thank you for answering that one. Here's another one. How do we interpret the CVSS score? Like, do we need to be worried if it's greater than a CVSS score of 4, no matter if it's a remote code execution, DOS, or information disclosure?
Yeah, so CVSS or CVSS v2, it's a metric. So what I think the PCI standard says anything over a CVSS score 5 is an automatic failure on the system. But if you have, what if you have 20 things scoring 4? Are you better? Are you less secure than the person who has one thing scoring 5? I take it as a relative guideline. If you've got a 10s affecting your system, yeah, definitely pay attention to those. Get those ones first. They're the worst problem. And that scales back down to something that's a 1 that you may not care that much about. But to the point about, like, how modern pen testers and attackers are working, those 4s and 5s and 3s add up to compromise. They add up to, all right, we leaked a little bit of a password, and then given that we already had the password, and something might be a 4 because it says, we leaked the credit username. And something might be a 4 or 5 because it says, well, it assumes you already have the username, or it assumes you already have LAN access, and therefore it's less exploitable. Well, maybe something else gave them the username, and maybe something else got them, a shell on the box, even if it's unprivileged. And so those chained together do make a higher risk. That said, yeah, I would, if I was all other things being equal, I would patch the CVSS 10 issues first and the CVS 1 issues last. But you got to take into account the location of your network and the risk and the content of the system too. A 4 on your Active Directory domain controller is maybe more concerned than a 4 on your developer or a front desk person's laptop or desktop machine.
Yeah, I mean, that kind of relates to the slide earlier where we were talking about how different vulnerabilities can potentially have different risks on different systems. Cool. Here is an interesting one. And we are getting some good questions, so we are going to stay online and answer a few more. So definitely feel free for the audience to keep asking your question. If we don't get to it, we will respond to you in a few days or early next week with some of the answers to your questions. But here's one that I think is particularly interesting because I don't know the answer to this. So the guy's asking you, basically with cloud services and cloud computing, like, what is your take on whether it makes you more or less vulnerable to attackers? I know it's a loaded question.
Yeah. Well, yeah, you're certainly not the first person to ask that. And are you more or less vulnerable if you're using cloud services? I don't want to. I'm trying to find another way to say it depends without saying it depends. Cloud services allow you to defray risk and cost. So you can assign the risk of a compromise to your cloud service provider, and you can by contract or by threat of litigation or other means of assigning risk, make them responsible for certain types of things. It doesn't help you if your brand receives reputation damage. It doesn't help you if it doesn't help you if it's Amazon's fault somehow if you lose customer data that becomes public and all of a sudden your company is associated with the losing customer data. And to some degree you have less control. Some degree of less control because they're not there, but then you might have other better standards in place through the cloud. So I don't really think cloud services, one way or the other, actually has a direct correlation to your vulnerability stance. It might be a means of defraying your security posture in any implicit way. It can be a means of deferring or assigning risk.
Okay, good, awesome. Appreciate that.
I'll footnote that is that probably cloud services are probably better able to withstand distributed denial of service type of attacks than the average individual data center is going to be. I'll just put that one out there for sure. On the other hand, you might be more exposed, so it depends on the nature of your business.
Okay, good, awesome, very cool. Well, let's look at another one here where a question talks about like if a vulnerability is like a potential exploit, like what's a potential vulnerability?
Potential vulnerability is one of the most, if you're in the vulnerability management space or you've been working with a number of vulnerability management vendors for years, then potential vulnerability is a very overloaded, thrown around term, and all of the main vulnerability management companies use it a bit differently. So when we say potential vulnerability at Rapid7 in a vulnerability scan, we're saying that we've detected the version of something that we think is vulnerable, but we haven't gone through and really either exploited it or gone into a really, really detailed, specific check about the actual files involved to see if it were for quite sure it's vulnerable. We're instead saying this looks like something that's vulnerable. Other companies mean that a bit differently. Other organizations have used the term to mean, for example, you have a vulnerability in the version of FTP server that's all installed on your machine, but you're not running FTP server right now. And so there's the potential for a vulnerability to be there should you decide to turn on your FTP server tomorrow, but it's not present in an exploitable way at this time. I don't really think either one of those is wrong or right way of phrasing it, but it is a very bandied about term. Usually when we're using it and when some of our competitors are using it, we're talking about something that looks like it might be vulnerable and we can't be sure with the information we have, either because we didn't have credentials on the box or even with credentials there was some limited access and we weren't able to get in and look at everything we needed to say you're definitely vulnerable. And so it kind of becomes like a threshold of information saying, do you want to know about things where you might be vulnerable but we're not sure, which is good for the security analyst, good for the pen tester who's looking for any option that they can play around with and then do follow-up on, bad for the IT team who may get told to go patch something that isn't patchable. So it becomes a filtering issue.
Yeah, and PCI looks at like potentials too, right?
PCI does look at the potentials. PCI has this sort of inherent, PCI scanning has this inherent contradiction in it, in that in order to be a certified PCI scan vendor, you have to be able to detect a laundry list of vulnerabilities that they've gone and put out there and said, you're going to find these things. Some of those things are not at all detectable without actually authenticating the box. You can't be 100%. Some of those things are impossible to be sure of without logging into the box and checking. Yet the PCI Council says, no, if you find this box and it's running this service and it's at this version, you're going to report it vulnerable for further follow-up rather than find out. You don't have the option to find out in the PCI world. So that does they do require us to include potentials in the PCI standards, in the PCI reports.
Okay, awesome. Thank you for that. And we have time for one more question, and we've gotten a ton, so we'll definitely follow up with you. But this last one's pretty interesting and a good one, I think, to end on. Within, let's say, like the past year, right? Let's say the person's basically asking, was there anything that surprised you from a vulnerability standpoint in the past year that if you were looking at last year, January 1st, 2013. Was there something that surprised you last year that you wouldn't have expected from a vulnerability standpoint?
It's a good question. I'm trying to think back. It's been a busy year. We had a couple of IEO days. That wasn't really all that surprising. I think we saw
an increase in O days.
Yeah, we saw that. So I think we saw the the drone that got forced down that they think may have DOS the system. I think that was actually, I'm trying to remember if that was last year or the year before. That didn't actually surprise me, but I was like, oh, I predicted that. That was in I think that was my 2012 prediction that you'd see drone malware. And then it happened. That was surprising that I was right, I think, when I was that one. Drone malware was something that was coming up there. I think the scale and sophistication of something like the recent huge point of sale compromise that we all know about was surprising to me. The NSA hacking was not at all surprising to me. Actually, that's what surprised me in 2013. I was surprised at how surprised people were by that. Maybe I'm paranoid. Maybe I've worked in the security industry too long. I just assumed that they were listening. I assumed that anything I send in a text message, an email, or otherwise is being soaked up by the NSA or one of their other national conference. I never thought it was all that surprising. It was like, oh, really? Edward Snowden's disclosing something that everybody already knew, right? People lost it. People are shocked. People are up in arms. And I'm like, really? You're surprised by this? You think when they shut down Carnivore in 1993 that they didn't replace it with something more sophisticated? Come on. Like that I was honestly surprised at how surprised people were by that. And I'm going way off on a tangent here because it's not really about vulnerability, but that was the most surprising thing in information security for me in 2013 was how surprised people were by that.
Awesome. That's a great one. That's a really good one. And with that, I just want to thank Ross. Thank you again for joining today's webcast and going through vulnerabilities and really giving the audience really a clear understanding of kind of what you're seeing, especially from your standpoint, and some of the things to think about in the future. And I want to thank the audience for attending today's webcast, and we will have a recording of it that we'll send you after. And for the people that did continue to ask questions, we will follow back up with you. And if you have any other questions, just feel free to reach out to us. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all.
Yeah, thanks, Ross.
Thanks for the chance.
Okay, bye.